Join us and log on. We are so excited for tonight's event. We have former CIA analyst Cindy Otis and Yahoo News reporter Jenna McLaughlin here to chat with us in just a moment about Cindy's book, True or False, which came out today. Just going to pause here a moment longer just to give everybody a chance to connect. All right. Okay, I see several of us are on now, and we can go ahead and get started, I think. So thank you again for your patience. All right, hi everyone. Welcome to PMP Live. My name is Michelle and I'm a bookseller with the Children and Teen Department. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are happy to still bring you politics and prose author events, but from the comfort of your own home. Tonight, we are so excited to have Cindy Otis with us to discuss her new book, True or False, a CIA analyst guide to spotting fake news, which came out today, so congrats. Cindy is joined in conversation with Jenna McLaughlin, a national security and investigations reporter for Yahoo News. You can purchase True or False on our website. We will be posting a link shortly, and we are excited to offer signed book plates from Cindy while supplies last. Tonight, you can ask the author questions by clicking Q&A located at the bottom of your screen. You can also vote on your favorite questions, and at the end, we'll have time to go over some together. As always, please remember this is a creative, safe space, and we ask that folks be respectful of one another in any questions and comments. Now, on to tonight's event. It is my pleasure to introduce critically acclaimed author Cindy Otis, joined in conversation by Jenna McLaughlin. From 2007 to 2017, Cindy Otis served at the CIA as an analyst, intelligence briefer, and manager in the Directorate of Intelligence. Now in the private sector, Cindy is one of the leading experts in disinformation. She recently joined the Alethea Group as the Vice President of Analysis. She also joined the Atlantic Council in April as a senior non-resident fellow in the Digital Forensic Research Lab. Cindy is a frequent news commentator and writer on issues such as national security, intelligence, and disinformation. And she is a member of USA Today's Board of Contributors. Her book, True or False, has already received starred reviews from Publishers Weekly and the School Library Journal. It is an engaging and practical guide to decipher the truth amidst the flood of information we receive every day. It follows the evolution of fake news over the centuries and its dramatic effects. With many photographs of historical documents, internet screenshots, and interactive drills, this guide will help readers young and old apply Cindy's tips and learn from her expertise. Jenna McLaughlin is a national security and investigations reporter for Yahoo News, where she focuses on the intelligence community, foreign policy, and other issues. McLaughlin previously covered intelligence and national security for CNN, Foreign Policy Magazine, The Intercept, and Mother Jones Magazine, following her graduation from Johns Hopkins University in 2014. And now, without further ado, I'm excited to turn the conversation over to Cindy and Jenna. So enjoy.
Thank you so much, Michelle and Politics and Prose, for having us. It's such a storied institution in DC, and I feel lucky to be a part of it. And congratulations, Cindy, on your publication. I know it's been long awaiting, and it's finally here. So hooray.
Thank you so much.
I'm so excited to be here with you, Cindy. I've known you for years now. When I found out that you'd be working on this book, I was really excited for readers of all ages to be able to experience the way you can transport people to your world and sort of take them on a tour with you, whether that's the halls of Langley at the CIA, or whether that's your work in disinformation, seeking out social media posts and fake Twitter accounts. You know, you can really bring people there and communicate with them face to face, I think. I think most readers will emerge from this a lot smarter and feel like you've made a new friend. Like you can picture yourself sort of walking down the halls of the CIA or analyzing important and secret information and delivering a briefing to the president. Because nowadays, with so much information online and on social media and in the news, average people are forced to use those kinds of skills and to prevent being manipulated in their everyday lives. So I'd love to just kick things off, Cindy, by asking you to talk a little bit about what inspired you to write the book and what was that moment and what made you think that this was the right time?
Sure. Well, first, I just want to say thank you so much to Politics and Prose for hosting me, and to you, Jenna, as well for being game to chat with me tonight. And also, thanks so much to everyone who's joining in. I know, we were headed for an in-person event, and now we're online, but it just means that we get to chat with more folks. So, thanks so much for joining. So going back to sort of the start of this book, so I left the agency in mid 2017, and it was at a time where the world really was starting to learn and understand the extent to which Russia interfered in the US presidential election in the year earlier. Um, and I had spent most of my career undercover, and the thought of even having a public Twitter account terrified me to death. But I also kind of felt like maybe there was something that I could contribute to the national conversation on this issue, based on my skills and experiences at the agency. And so I sort of reluctantly joined Twitter and just sort of started writing and putting out articles and things like that on national security issues. And the number one question that I got from folks in response to those articles and my tweets was just, how do I sort out fact from fiction? I'm overwhelmed. I'm just, under this waterfall of information every single day. It's in my social media feeds. I'm on websites. I'm getting news alerts. It's just a lot. I'm feeling so overwhelmed. I don't really know how to tell what's true and what's false from the content in my feeds. And so, help me, because I feel like giving up. And I started, just sort of putting some tweets out there and doing a couple of pieces on it and stuff. And I realized really quickly that a book was needed. There wasn't really sort of anything quite like it that walked through very very actionable kinds of advice, but also put all of this in context, because the other piece of this that I was seeing was this very understandable collective panic over what they were learning about Russian interference. And I wanted to say, okay, absolutely unprecedented level of Russian interference in our political systems. But at the same time, this has been going on for a very long time. The use of false information, disinformation, and conspiracy theories, covert influence through intelligence agencies and governments, all of that has been going on for a very long time. So while the panic is understandable, there are actually lessons learned from those historical experiences that we can apply to now. So it was sort of that, wanting to provide actionable tips for people, but also wanting to put it into context.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, how quickly people forget history, even, within administrations. One thing I'd love to talk about up top, just because it's something that I find really interesting and that we've talked about before, and I think is relevant to that answer, is sort of the universes of both intelligence and journalism, how those two things are actually extremely similar, and how we can continue to communicate better what our roles in those jobs are. Like, how exactly does being a former CIA analyst make you particularly good at communicating these messages? What was the sort of day-to-day like that provided you those skills? How can you bring people inside that world and make it a little bit less scary?
Yeah. So, the job of an intel analyst is to essentially comb through huge amounts of information and data on a daily basis from multiple streams of sources and reporting, all the way from very classified information to completely open source stuff that you yourself can find off of Google or what have you. And they're meant to apply their skills, their expertise, and their training to figuring out what from that information is accurate, and using it to analyze sort of very quickly moving global events in a way that can help inform policymakers in the United States to make hopefully good decisions, good and informed decisions to advance the interests of the United States and our allies. So when people were coming to me saying, I'm feeling just very overwhelmed by all of these streams of information, I was like, I hear you. You know, I also remember many a day feeling very overwhelmed because I worked primarily as a military analyst, and therefore a lot of very quickly moving crises. And so, you know, the skills and tools that I learned sort of as a baby analyst and then applied throughout my career are absolutely things that people can apply to their own vetting of information. And it's things like, you know, investigating the source of your information and, you know, asking questions and recognizing your own biases and things. All of those are the tools that analysts use every day to, you know, to analyze the information that they're receiving. And so it's exactly what sort of average information consumers on the outside should be doing as well.
Absolutely. And I'd love to just dial back a little bit and talk a little bit about what made you choose to be an intelligence analyst, particularly with the military. Like, what got you interested in that?
Yeah, so I'm not actually joking when I say that the sort of first time that it crossed my mind that I wanted to work in Intel was when my dad showed me my first James Bond film as a kid. He was very much into them. And I thought to myself, well, that's, you know, that seems like a very exciting life. I was interested in as a kid about anything having to do with any country in the world, any language, any culture, any history. I found the world, you know, in other countries much more fascinating than my own sort of narrow place in the world. And you know, I put off that sort of dream for a while. You know, I'm a woman with a disability and have been my entire life. And I didn't necessarily know if there was a, you know, a role for somebody with a disability in the organization. And it actually sort of one of those very Hallmark movie sort of moments in which a high school teacher was like, have you ever considered, you know, working in national security? And I, you know, I said, well, yes, I love the world. I love learning about any other culture, any language, etc. And for some reason, I mean, he pulled up the CIA website in his classroom. It was my AP government class. And he pulled up the website right in the classroom and was like, well, let's start looking for jobs. And so, you know, teachers, bless them.
A lot.
They change lives, like literally. So, so that's what got me interested in it. I actually started federal government work working in the Department of the Army as a civilian, working in communications and public affairs. And so my start was in military issues. And I was also just a huge fan of NATO. I was such a NATO nerd in college. My teachers used to call my friends of European exchange students and the EU in all of our classes, just because I was such a Europhile. So the military side of things always just fascinated me.
Right. And I think you make an important point about teachers here and that they can inspire you to do all sorts of things. I remember having an AP writing teacher who made us write all these crazy tomes and books of essays. And I think a lot of my love for writing comes from that. And I think this is an important space to talk about your book. I mean, clearly it's something that is very accessible. The way it's written is really approachable. It dives into history, but it's conversational. It feels like you're speaking with your reader, which is really great. And I wanted to ask you, we had been talking about this earlier, but why did you choose to use that sort of narrative tone? Why did you think of young adults when you were looking at this? Do you feel like this needs to be in classrooms? Because I do.
Yeah, so I'm a longtime lover of YA literature. I myself turned from a reluctant reader as a child into a voracious reader because I found the right book that spoke to me, that it was the first book that I ever sort of felt represented by. And so I knew that when a book is written for a particular audience with them in mind, it could be very transformative. I'm also very lucky to have a wonderful family that has given me a bunch of nieces and nephews who I adore. And you know, I see them on their phones all day. I see them on social media. I see them on forums where I'm spending my time, you know, hunting white supremacists and you know, Russian intel posing as Americans and things like that. And, you know, it made me think it's really, the kids nowadays are more online than any other generation. When I was growing up, we had dial-up internet. AOL, where we had to put money in a jar to pay for our minutes. And we just don't understand, my generation, the extent to which these kids are literally online from the beginning of the moment they're born, and their picture is posted on social media, in the delivery room. So I knew that young readers needed the tools and tactics to be able to employ from day one, as they start to become social media users and information consumers, that I didn't necessarily have when I was learning how the internet worked, as a kid. So it was sort of both of those things. One, I just loved YA, and two, I really, the point of the book is to be really like, adopt good tools and tactics yourself, because this is a problem all of us have to tackle. And so the idea of being able to create sort of a next generation of folks who have that, have those tools and tactics that they can employ from the beginning, to keep themselves safe, frankly, and their information spaces safe. That was definitely a strong motivator. In terms of like the tone, I'm so glad that you found it, sort of very personal, because the image that I had in my mind when I was writing it, was I wanted it to feel like me and the reader having a chat. We're in like the living room, or we're at a coffee shop, or we're at fill in the blank sort of calm, comfy place. And it's me answering your questions. It's just me, Cindy, your like friendly neighborhood former CIA analyst,
Right now.
just just like hanging out, and me like trying to calm your fears, and and that sort of thing. So
Awesome. Yeah. And I see that a couple of our attendees are and asking the follow-up question that I had, and not to put you on the spot, but I'm wondering if you remember what that book was that got you into reading. I'm curious myself.
My gosh. So I wish I knew. I actually don't, and I'm like desperate to find it. It was a book about a girl who was experiencing something as a child that I also had experienced, and I didn't know anyone else who had experienced the same thing, but this girl in this book did. I'm absolutely desperate to find it. But from there, it launched me into things like Hatchet. I really got into survival books after that.
Too.
And yeah, these sort of exploring kinds of adventure, really, I think, fed my passion for sort of discovering the world. But that first book, it's this elusive book that I don't even think it was sort of a big name book.
Yeah.
I just sort of found it dusty on the shelf of my elementary school library. But someday I'm going to find it, and I'm going to have an answer.
I love that. I feel like the story of you finding it will be its own article, at least. that
Maybe.
Interested in reading. I'd love to just dive into the news, because of course I'm a journalist, and that's what I love to do. Clearly there's a lot going on right now. The global pandemic, there are murder hornets, law enforcement landing on American cities, millions of Americans out of work, an election coming that I continue to forget about, even though it's less than 100 days now. I think it's overwhelming. I'm sure news of a meteorite hurtling towards Earth is coming tonight. What are your biggest concerns about how these chaotic events might be manipulated by criminals and adversaries? And it continues to increase. Do you feel like there needs to be sort of an additional urgency right now?
Yeah. So an additional urgency, but also an additional caution, I guess I would say, because sort of increasing the level of panic doesn't actually help our critical thinking skills, which we so desperately need to employ right now. So there's a lot to this question, with everything that's going on. So some of the things that concern me is, first of all, we're living in what those of us who work in disinformation are calling an infodemic. And that's because, literally like 3 months after I stopped, or I sort of had my final say on my book, we kicked off sort of the largest period in terms of scale and scope of disinformation and misinformation in world history because of a global pandemic. And so we're sort of living in this very perfect storm scenario right now, where you have the global pandemic, you have national unrest over police violence, you have the election coming up, and it's just such a ripe target for bad actors to sow false, misleading, sensational content, conspiracy theories, and all of that. Meanwhile, the number of players that are delving into this space only grows as people see, not only can I potentially advance my ideological cause, if you're a domestic actor using disinformation, or if you're a foreign government using disinformation, I can, sow seeds of chaos or political division, or, undermine the credibility of the United States, but also financially motivated actors who realize you can make a lot of money
Oh,
from
yeah.
pushing out false information, everything from coronavirus miracle cures, which don't exist, to sensational political content on websites that are loaded with pay-per-click ads. And also, by the way, collecting massive amounts of data on you that then that person can also go and sell, right? So the number of actors is increasing, and there are just so many different ways, so many different narratives that they could target or pull on or sow, that could go viral. I mean, instantly. There could be something happening right now, I'm sure there is, of somebody planting a narrative. And the kinds of narratives that I worry about for the next couple of months are the ones that blend these different things that are happening. So, so for example, coronavirus related false information to discourage people from showing up to vote, election related information about absentee ballot process or mail-in ballot processes, using, national unrest or some other kind of particular current day issue to, undermine the legitimacy of mail-in voting, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's scary and overwhelming. Even as a journalist, we speak in our morning call and editors are asking for us to report out each of these different threads, and it's completely crazy. And I can't even imagine just being an average person trying to follow it. I feel like one of the strategies that seems to be on the mind of at least this administration right now is looking at these things like TikTok, another place where there could be lots of disinformation spreading. Who knows? Right now it's just silly music videos, but what the future of this, super popular app is, no one knows. I feel like this question doesn't quite have an answer yet, but do you feel like the sort of urge to just ban things like that is not necessarily going to be helpful? How do we combat this disinformation with sort of more good information, or do you feel like that's an effective strategy?
Yeah, so this is a big question too. There's sort of a lot to it. You're asking tough questions, Jenna. So no, I mean, so we're still learning about effective counter strategies essentially at this point. And the US government at this point has sort of deferred to social media platforms to make decisions on things like what is harmful content, what is hate speech, what is free speech, what is political opinion, and all of those things. So that makes me nervous, as social media companies are for-profit industries that have their own motives and their own goals. And therefore, you can see how different companies are handling this issue. We talk about sort of social media companies, but the fact of the matter is, Facebook has a very different strategy, policies, and the resources, committed to combating this issue compared to YouTube or a Reddit or TikTok. And so they're not a monolith. They have very different capabilities and policies on this issue. So that's another challenge, is they're all sort of doing very different things. So when you look at, for example, Facebook banning a video like they did last night, we tend to focus on that as, well, that's taking action. But the fact of the matter is the content lives on multiple other social media platforms, most of which aren't the large ones. It's sort of more fringe platforms,
Right.
And fringe websites where this stuff ends up living. And so the sort of banning and removal, the effectiveness of that is, it's very questionable. And so what are the better solutions? I mean, I do think there has to be some level of content removal when you're dealing with things that could, that are heading towards or encouraging violence and things like that, certainly. But there's also the issue of making sure that accurate content from legitimate sources is being promoted. And something that absolutely terrifies me, and I mean, you can speak to this much better than I can, is the cuts to particularly local media outlets, but also national outlets as well, that we rely on to provide that good content and accurate information and be checks on things like corruption and those in power. They're just getting decimated. And some of these other sort of fringe elements are on the rise and making money. So yeah, I actually would love to hear your thoughts on all that.
Yeah, I mean, many thoughts on all that. I mean, it feels like it's been years since sort of, the days of pivot to video and different strategies of making money with news, and it always feels like the most straightforward news coverage is not the stuff that necessarily everybody wants to read, right? Sometimes my big investigative stories get a lot of click, but the everyday explainer on TikTok and the threat to national security, for example, I'm not sure that that's as hot as some of the political news. Yeah, I mean, fingers crossed that I continue to be able to have that role, but I know friends at other outlets who have not. So I think that it's going to take a lot of collective thought from not only news and media professionals, but smart business-minded folks to think about how to continue to bring news into the future and make sure that people, put their money where their mouth is and recognize its value and say, I want to have a subscription to these 4 newspapers, one of them local, hopefully a couple national, and continue to follow websites and magazines. I do not have the answer to that. If I did, I think I'd probably be making a lot more money. That would be nice. Before we sort of switch over to the audience Q&A, I know that's coming soon, and I'm keeping an eye on those, everybody. I'd love to just give you a chance to talk a little bit about more of the specifics of your book, since I've gotten to read it already, so I have a bit of a preview, so you can give others a preview. So I've read a couple different books on disinformation this year, and each approach the topic in a really different way. And I think from the beginning, you take a really historical and conversational approach and bring back examples that are both familiar and I think unfamiliar to readers. And I'm curious sort of how you went about choosing, from Ramses in Egypt and his self-promoting fake news story to, Jack the Ripper, et cetera. Like, how did you go about thinking about how to choose those, and why did you feel like history was an important element here?
Yeah. So I'll actually answer your last question first. So the historical component for me on this was very important to include. I sort of mentioned it earlier, but just I just sort of felt like people needed this issue to be put into context, because it was being covered and sort of talked about, Russian interference, that is, as this brand new thing that came out of nowhere. Other countries didn't do anything like this before, and that sort of thing. And I felt like we were actually missing a lot of good historical context that would show that there are lessons learned that we can apply to this, today. Even though social media has certainly changed and technology developments have certainly changed the extent to which things have been, can go viral and be amplified, and create, content can be created and all of that. That there were still these really important threads throughout history that we could learn from, and particularly threads about narrative and how narrative has been sort of weaponized throughout history. So, for example, something you'll see throughout the book in a lot of the historical examples is false information being used against women in positions of power, or used to target people of color or those from other marginalized communities, in order to justify things like violence against them. How conspiracies were used by people in power who absolutely knew that they were, wrong, but they were able to sort of weaponize these conspiracy theories to change the course of history. And in selecting the cases, I wanted to, there were certainly a lot of different time periods and figures and events to pull from, but I wanted to primarily focus on raising ones that people would probably have heard of. Students in particular had maybe learned pieces of it in their classes, and show the extent to which false information actually changed the course of that event, or changed how we think about the event now. So Jack the Ripper is a good example. It was a fun one. It was, and that's why I started the book with it. But, you know, what I knew about Jack the Ripper was a very sort of like demonic, nightmarish, like boogeyman who lives under your bed, right? Which is sort of how I think we all probably think about Jack the Ripper. But false information played a huge role in the sort of narrative that was created about him, and also in the police of the time, their inability to actually find the real murderer. And I sort of, you know, I show a couple of different cases where, you know, what we think of the person now was influenced by false information, like Marie Antoinette, where people still think to this day that she said, "Let them eat cake." And I'll have to give props to my mom, who actually raised the War of the Worlds. I talk about the War of the Worlds. Was in the 1930s when Orson Welles did a reenactment on the radio of the War of the Worlds, and there was this, you know, the narrative that came out of that was that there was this mass national hysteria because people thought that this alien invasion was actually real. So she's the one who got that one into the book, and she's quite proud of herself.
Oh, that's awesome. Moms give the best advice. That's
yes.
So I think we will soon sort of transition into audience questions, but I just wanted to very quickly, I know you've been sharing some of your sort of top tips and tricks on social media the last couple of days, and I'd love for you to be able to kind of just boil those down. Those graphics have been really great, and I think at least one person asked for that advice as well. What are your top tricks?
Okay, so my top tricks. So first, I should say the point of the book is not to turn you into a disinformation investigator like I am. I don't expect you to, you know, be trolling the forums with me, looking for baddies, but there are some things that you can implement in your sort of social media and news consumption practices. So those things are I think relatively simple. They can just often take time, which is why I think you know, we tend to be drawn to the allure of just quickly sharing things on social media. But it really is worth the time it takes to run through some of the steps. So those are things like looking at the source of the information. So are you looking at a Twitter account and it's a text post and they cite nothing? There's nothing, you know, that you can sort of go off of from their post to verify because they're not citing anything. Do you know the account? Do you know the person behind it? Can you ask them a follow-up question of, you know, where are you getting this information? Do they cite a picture or a video or a website that you can do further research on? So you can, I talk in my book about doing something like a reverse image search on a photo to see if the photo has maybe been taken out of context or recycled, which is something we see all the time, particularly in sort of crisis situations,
Right.
like shootings or bombings or that sort of thing. If it's a website, you know, oftentimes, and I mentioned it in my book, but the majority of Americans don't read past the headline of something that's cited. But if you actually click on the website, you will often see pretty basic red flags of signs that a website isn't actually legit. Like there are no authors listed on the articles. It's a WordPress site, and some of the template elements are still up. For example, social media icons that lead to nowhere. And that sort of thing. There are a lot of these sort of junk news kinds of sites out there that actually are getting content to go, you know, to trend and things like that. And if folks, you know, sort of did that next step of just looking at the website, I think they would see some of these red flags, but I go through those red flags. But really, you know, sort of foremost is recognizing your own biases. And, you know, so much of the misinformation that is spread, for example, about coronavirus has been based on sort of shunning scientific information in favor of relying on your own personal experiences. So in the case of coronavirus, do I know somebody who has coronavirus? If not, you know, potentially the person is more likely to think that it's a hoax because they haven't seen for themselves the actual evidence. But if you're somebody who, you know, you've got family in the ICU, you know this thing is not a hoax. So recognizing how those personal sort of biases and personal experiences affect and change the way that we interpret information and the things that we even think are accurate and not.
Right, right. And just as a really quick follow-up, I mean, I was sort of taking an open source investigative course with Bellingcat the other day, and a lot of the techniques are sort of advanced, but there are some obvious ones, right? Like clicking through and seeing if the picture is obviously manipulated, doing a quick reverse image search, which is pretty easy.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder how you feel about, as enemies, adversaries, criminals, once people hopefully do get better at recognizing those types of things, do you worry about the bad guys getting more advanced? And do you think the sort of tactics need to continue to get advanced as that happens?
Yes, it's absolutely something I worry about, to the point where I'm like, should I post this online anymore with sort of my, the results of my investigation in a walkthrough. People who work in the open source intel community pride themselves on being very transparent about how they do things, but I absolutely worry that, I mean, I know I'm followed by some very interesting people, and I know that some of those people are probably taking notes on the approach that I use in investigation. So I have been more careful lately about putting things online. Um, Governments like Russia are only getting better at this. Other countries are delving into this space using domestic disinformation capabilities that they've deployed at home, increasingly now using those on foreign policy objectives on the outside. And a lot of those countries are sort of at the learning stages of figuring out how to do it well, but they're going to get better as well. And so absolutely worry about groups and governments and individuals getting more sophisticated. That's why I'm also a huge proponent of technology development. A lot of the innovative work that different companies is doing now. I have some hope.
That's great. We love to end with some hope and shift over to some of the questions from our 81 participants, which is pretty high. That's great. So the first one that seems to be the most popular goes back to those social media companies. So we have a question from Sarah Dare, who says, if you could sit down with Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey, and Sundar Pichai, what best practices would you advise them to employ to prevent the spread of disinformation? No difficult task sitting down with those three. And would you, second, as a follow-up, would you advise people to not download TikTok?
That's a great question. I would love to be in the room with them, actually. Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing that I would stress with them is that they need to boost their internal response capability across the board to manage this issue. Because the fact of the matter is, when problematic content comes onto their platform, there are so many processes internally that, for the most part, things are not acted upon until they've had millions of views, and it's been shared so many times that at that stage it's impossible to remove. For example, again, sort of the video that was all the talk yesterday. The story today was that it had been removed from platforms like Facebook, but still showing up in my feeds across social media platforms. So they really need to increase the amount of resources and personnel that they have devoted to this issue, because they need to be able to operate in the same speed in which information moves on their platforms, and no social media platform at this point has near that capability.
Absolutely. So what about TikTok? Would you advise people?
Oh, TikTok, yeah. Yeah, my niece told me, oh, you have to see this TikTok video, and I was like, oh my gosh, like, take it off of your phone. So yes, I would advise people to take TikTok off their phone.
Yeah, I just try to watch the videos from another platform if possible. I don't want them getting a hold of all my data. So I had a question from McBacchio, who is great that you're here, who worked for Pete Buttigieg doing information security. So that's pretty cool. So he asked, what was the cutoff when writing discourse manipulation seems to occur daily? Was there a moment when you sort of decided that you have enough examples, or were you sort of overflowing with examples? And second, he asks, aside from being able to use a credit card at Starbucks, what was the biggest adjustment after leaving the agency?
I love these questions. Yeah. So unfortunately, my sort of decision to, okay, I've got enough, was actually dictated by publishing timelines. So when the pandemic started and all of these examples were popping up, I was like, oh, is there time to just like work in like maybe even like a epilogue or something, like a one little chapter, but my my deadlines had been sort of long since over. So yeah, it was more that. And also, frankly, word count was a limit. So I had to sort of limit my examples. But you'll see in the book that I move very briskly through it. The point of the historical anecdotes are to give a sense of how false information shaped these different events. But there's so much more to the history of these figures and events that I mentioned that could have been each of them, a full book themselves, sort of exploring that issue. So word count and publishing timelines, I wish I had a better answer for that one. But after the biggest adjustment after leaving the agency, I think it was just like joining the world via social media. I was terrified, like absolutely terrified, tweeting in the beginning. And I was telling a friend of mine that it actually still makes me quite nervous every single day to be on social media and to do interviews and things like this, to sort of publicly identify with my former employer. So just because it's sort of beaten into you that you need to be very, careful. So so that was a huge adjustment, just publicly identifying myself.
Right. I agree. And luckily we have folks like you to help explain that secret world. Otherwise we'd be totally in the dark. So this question was kind of already posed, but I think if you have any additional tips to identify false information beyond sort of going to the source and maybe doing a reverse image search, are there other sort of additional bits of tips and tricks that you have?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. So, when you're looking at a sort of news crisis sort of situation, it's important to understand that people like to take advantage of the chaos of that kind of sort of information overloaded time. And so you're going to see a lot more of people saying, well, I was at the event and here's my story and here's a picture from this event, and that sort of thing. And so you want to be especially careful of what you're sharing during a crisis situation, in part because emergency responders and groups like that are trying to sort through what's happening themselves. And so cluttering the information space can really harm their efforts. For example, I keep thinking it's hurricane season right now, and you'll often see when a hurricane touches down that suddenly your social media feed is filled with pictures of like sharks swimming down city streets and buildings caving over. Yeah, and it's usually from like the end of the world kinds of movies, like the sort of summer blockbuster where like the world explodes. I'm trying to think of an example, but one isn't coming to me. And people will take like screenshots of the movie and then be like, oh my god, like this is New York, or this is downtown Houston, and it's really just actually taken from a movie. But things like that go viral all the time. So that sort of crisis situation is really important to do all of the things that we talked about before in terms of investigating information.
Yeah, I've seen that shark photo so many times.
Right?
It's so realistic in a weird way, and you want to believe it because it's so crazy.
Like the dolphins in Venice.
Yeah. The next question is kind of fun and kind of brings us back to your YA discussion. What's your favorite young adult book? Do you have a favorite right now? Is it older, new? It's a little hard to think of.
I have a million favorites. So you can see behind me, this is like a third of my library of books. And this entire thing is full of YA. I have another one next to me that is also half full of YA. So, and then my Kindle is absolutely overloaded. So I'm a huge YA reader, always have been. So I think one of the most important books ever written in literature that I would love to scatter like seeds on the planet is The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. Anything by Becky Albertalli, who wrote Simon versus the Homo sapiens Agenda, and most recently Love Creekwood, which is a novella, where she actually just admitted totally casually the other day that she actually wrote me into it. So amazing for anyone who loves Simon. Also Internment by Samira Ahmed. Anything by Aisha Saeed. Nadine Jolie Courtney's written several that I love. Gosh, I mean, I just want to like show you my shelf and be like, all of these.
Yes.
Anything by Libba Bray. I love Libba Bray. She writes sort of like fantasy / horror YA. Yeah, I could go on about this for a while, but those are some of my
read. During the pandemic. We'll have to get out our Kindles. Awesome. So the next question I'll sort of rephrase a little bit, because it seems to be implying that national security reporters are sharers of fake news, which I can assure you that I personally investigate and report all of my stories. But I think part of this question that I'm really interested in is, back in 2016, clearly there was this sort of new era of reporters being on the receiving end of stolen information, digitally stolen information. As we're sort of walking up to 2020, how are you thinking about how journalists and even just average citizens, you know, the average person on Twitter can almost become their own citizen journalist? How do you think that people should be thinking about handling that information, whether it's stolen, whether it's manipulated, whether it's misleading? I think that that's an interesting angle into that question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's important to go back to something that I sort of alluded to earlier, which is that people who are using false information really succeed when they're pushing the sensational and the emotional. They're trying to trigger an emotional response. Primarily anger, fear, anxiety, because those are the things that we get into this sort of fight or flight mode mentally, where we just want to share information with as many people as possible. We want to warn them about what we're seeing. And so again, those sort of critical thinking skills sort of fall by the wayside. And so when we're looking at countries who use those kinds of tactics, the sort of cyber attack plus targeting reporters, plus then sort of leaking, they're going for the sensational. Like, they want to sensationalize this as much as possible, and they're trying to get that content in front of the most influential people, the most influential people they can find. That could be reporters, that could be politicians, government officials. It could be social media influencers. Frankly, that's actually something that China uses pretty significantly, is social media influencers to push out pro-CCP talking points. And so, as you're looking at your feeds, the sort of clickbait, sensational, leaked documents, corruption, all of these sort of like buzz things that would get us to click and share, or sometimes just share, not click, to investigate. We really need to be careful about that kind of thing. We know that Russia's done it on, targeting the French election a couple of years back. They've done it in the UK as well. They've certainly done it to us. But they learned their lesson very, very well, that the sensational gets people to share without thinking. And so that's absolutely something that I anticipate we'll get another corruption from these leaked documents that appeared from nowhere suddenly on Reddit, for example, or fill in the blank social media platform that then accounts start promoting the heck out of.
Yeah, absolutely. And anything with secret, confidential, leaked, etc., is automatically more appealing to an editor, frankly, who needs to deliver something exclusive. So I think it is partially, at least, on the reporter's shoulders to try to sort of have that conversation with editors who might not understand your beat as much as you do, and say, listen, we need to handle this way or whichever way. Luckily, my editor is also a national security expert, so it's a little easier for me. I think we have time for just one last question, and luckily it comes from our friend David Priest. Thanks so much for coming, David.
Hey, David.
So thank you so much for your excitement shared at the beginning of the event. So what David asks is pretend, Cindy, that you are the moderator at the presidential debates these days. Whether we have them or not, I think remains to be seen. What role do you play, if any, in calling out egregious disinformation that happens on stage? If something happens during the debate that is clearly false or misleading, do you challenge it? And if so, how do you do that? Easy, right?
That's such an interesting question. I mean, I kind of think about it the way that I would think about having normal conversations with average people who are raising false content. I don't think that because you're a political official, you get a pass, frankly. But I've always been known to be one who's like, you know, I don't care if you're big and important, you're still a person. So, you know, I sort of think of it that way, that you know, when you're having these conversations, whether it's, you know, moderating a presidential debate, or you're you know, talking with a friend or teammate or family member, you know, facts are always going to be sort of what you've got on your side, right? And so if I were a moderator and false information was being sort of spouted to a significant degree on stage as a moderator, I would absolutely say, you know, but we know that this didn't actually happen, or, you know, the fact is blah blah blah, coronavirus, you know, coronavirus death numbers or something like that. So yeah.
Yeah, it puts a lot of the onus on the journalists to make sure they're up to date with their facts, and I do hope that that happens if we do have debates. I think that makes for a much better viewer experience. And I think with that, we are hitting the end of our time, and Michelle can send us off. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you both for sharing, and thank you, viewers, for all those great questions. I do have one more question for both of you. What are you currently reading? Would you like to share with us?
Go first.
Yeah. So I, in the earlier question of what YA I love, I'm kicking myself for not mentioning this one. I've already read it, so I'm going to mention it now. Break the Fall by Jennifer Iacopelli, who's a dear friend of mine and a tremendous writer. Very excited about one of my most anticipated YA fiction reads of the year, which is This Is My America by Kim Johnson, which also came out today. And then on the adult side, I am partway through Thomas Ridd's Active Measures.
Very cool.
I also really enjoyed Tom Ridd's Active Measures. It was excellent. But most recently, I'm currently reading Florida. It's a collection of short stories by Lauren Groff, and I'm really enjoying it.
Awesome.
As someone who was born in Florida.
No, that's great. And actually, we do have an event coming up for This Is My America viewers, so you can stay tuned for that. All right. Well, remember, viewers, you can still click the link to purchase True or False, which will come with a signed book plate from Cindy while supplies last. As an independent bookstore, please know that we're just so thankful for support from loyal customers like you. Want to let everyone know you can check out our website for updated event listings, and you can follow our children and teens department on social media under @KidsInProse. And with that, that wraps up our evening. So thank you again, Cindy and Jenna. Really enjoyed it. Thank you, viewers, and we hope to see you again soon. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.